Okay, well, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us for our first ever virtual pie baking. My name's Rachel Boyle. I'm the Executive Director at the New Zealand Chamber in Singapore. And I think there's something really comforting and really Kiwi about a pie. So this is a really great event for us to be doing. With me today, I have Mark Mottram from Simply Good Pies. He's also known as Lord of the Pies. I saw that on his email sign-off, so just had to put that one in there. Simply Good Pies, they're famous in Singapore for making handmade pies from the best ingredients, and Mark's going to guide us through the art of crafting a family pie today. And also thanks to Kiwi Kitchen, we have some Watties tomato sauce that you can enjoy with your pie afterwards. Now, if you do have questions for Mark as we go through, or if anything's going too fast, you can either enter them in the chat or put up your virtual hand and unmute yourself and just make sure you're not talking over the top of someone else if you've got any questions. But yeah, I'll keep an eye on the chat and on the hands going up. So now over to Mark for some pie baking.
Hey, good afternoon. So yes, thank you very much for inviting me to this. So this is going to be a fun session. We're going to make a family-sized pie, and you should all have a tray that I sent out for the set pie, and you should have a pie mix, either a beef or a chicken or a cheese one. It's worth saying at this stage that the cheese pie mix that the two people have is literally just cheese and onion. So you will need to add a couple of ingredients to that to actually make a good pie mix. If you just put cheese and onion into a pie and baked it, the fat would separate, the solids would go to the bottom, and you'd end up with a fatty, sort of movable, horrible mess. So just bear in mind at the moment, if you're going to be baking along, that you'll need either to add an egg to that, along with some seasoning, or you'll need to add some flour and a little bit of either alcohol or cream or water. Can I just ask, are the cheese people, are they baking along now, or will they be baking along later? Should be two people.
Baking now.
Baking now. Okay, so two things here. What you're trying to do, of course, is to get a homogenized melting cheese. So either, as I say, add one egg and your seasoning. There's no seasoning in the cheese and onion there. So you want to add some pepper. Don't put too much salt in because the cheese has a lot of salt in. And then some sort of dried herb, whichever one you like, really, some rosemary, some thyme. If you're going to go down the route of actually trying to make almost a fondue, that's adding a little bit of flour and a little bit of liquid. White wine works well, beer works well. So for the amount of mix that you've got, you'd need about 2 tablespoons, just roughly, don't be too accurate on this, about 2 tablespoons of flour. Mix that well into the mix. And then roughly the same, maybe a little bit more of liquid, so white wine or beer. And a hand up.
Zarina says, just cooked my own plant-based mince instead of using the cheese.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah, sure.
Right.
Can. Okay. So where were we? So yes, so the other mixes, let's just, everybody at the moment, if they can just get their mix and put it into a bowl, those that are going along. I've got the beef mix here. And what I've done when I've sent the mixes out is that they're under-seasoned. So we're just going to add a little bit of seasoning. Something to bear in mind, so I just forgot this, is let's put our ovens on now. Preheat ovens to 180 degrees. So while I'm talking, I'll put mine on. While I'm talking, everyone go and put their ovens on, because we will be needing them hot, okay? 180 degrees, a little bit less if it's a fan oven, so 170 degrees maybe, okay? So with the mixes, I think we've got 16 people on the beef, 2 people on cheese, 2 people on the chicken. So the beef is fairly well seasoned. It's steak and Guinness actually. But if you wanted to add you wanted to pep it up a little bit, you could add paprika. You could add obviously more pepper. Just taste it a little bit. Bear in mind it'll have more seasoning taste when it's warm. I've deliberately undersalted it.
180 degrees fan forced or normal?
180, yeah, fan is fine.
Okay.
Yeah. So between 170 and 180 on a fan, 180 on a non-fan. Yeah. I normally use 180 with a fan. Okay. Where was I? Oh yes, so seasoning. So yeah, just taste it. I deliberately undersalted it. So if you're a salt freak, then certainly add a little bit more salt. Things that are nice to add to something like a steak and Guinness or any beef style pie are things like ground ginger. You could add some more. Guinness if you wanted a more beery taste. To the chicken one, things like chopped apricot, some bacon if you wanted. I left it purely chicken because I didn't know if anybody was not eating pork, etc. But bacon's really nice in a chicken pie, and apricot's really nice just to lift it as well. Okay, so that's a little bit of extra seasoning there. Now, making pastry. So the pastry that I use in most of the pies here is actually a modified hot crust pastry. The issue that a lot of us have in this sort of climate when making pastry is that it's warm. So trying to make a pastry, and we've all done it where we've chilled the butter down, we've frozen the butter, we've chopped it into cubes, we've tried to do it, and you end up having to put it in and out of the freezer. So I use a hot crust method, which makes an exceptional pie crust, and that's used for most of my pies. So what we're going to do, we're actually going to make too much pastry for today. So we're going to use all of the butter that we've got and the water. So the hot crust pastry actually involves, to start with, boiling the fat, which is butter in this case, boiling the fat and the water together. So what I'm going to get, if everyone grabs a pan, so any old saucepan, I'm going to chop this butter up first so that it melts easier into the water. So we're going to use 250 grams of butter, and then we're going to use 300 grams or 300 milliliters, which is the same thing, of water. So 250 butter, that's the entire packet. Doesn't really matter what butter you use. I wouldn't bother using a fancy, expensive one for making a pastry with particularly. But if you want to, I suppose you can. Just get rid of that. Okay, I've weighed mine out already, but at this stage I'll put it on the scales. And I'm going to add the water to it. So we now have 250 grams of butter, 300 grams of water in the pan, and I'm just going to put that straight on the hob. Now, don't put it on a really fierce, maximum heat on either your electric or your gas, because you'll lose too much of the water into steam. What you're trying to do is warm it up a little bit more than gently, and then get it bubbling into a boil. Okay, so I know that'll take a few minutes. And then we talk about ratios when we're baking in the professional bakery. So this is a very easy ratio to remember when making hot crust pastry. So it's a 1-1-3 ratio. So it's one part fat, which in this case is butter, 1 part water, and 3 parts flour. Now I always add a little bit more water because we know that some water will turn into steam. So hence I use 250 grams, 300 grams, but it's essentially 1-1-3. We can use different fats and it'll create a slightly different texture in the pastry. For pork pies, for instance, we use lard. So we take animal fat, we render it down, we turn it into a liquid, and we use that as a fat. And it creates a slightly softer feel on the pastry, but with a nice crust on the outside. Is somebody asking a question?
Yeah, ideally, what temperature would you want to use? She has a Thermomix.
Oh, I don't know about a Thermomix, but what we're doing is boiling water with the fat. So I would suggest boiling water is 100 degrees centigrade. So that's the temperature you want to get your butter and water to, is 100 degrees.
And then, Mark, can we list here how much water flour measures? That's what we're going over now, right? The ratio.
So the ratio is 1-1-3. So actually, what we're doing here is, yes, we've got 250 gram of flour, 250 gram of butter, 300 gram of water, 750 gram of flour, and it's all-purpose flour.
Mhm.
Okay, so actually what we'll need for this pie, I know, because I've made many pies this size of foil actually makes a 1.2 kilogram pie. And pies, until they get massive, are roughly half and half pastry to mix. So what you got sent out yesterday as the pie mixes, apart from the cheese one, which required more to go into it, is 600 grams or a little bit more of pie mix. So you have 600 grams of mix and you have 600 grams of pastry. So if you wanted to make exactly the right amount of pastry to make this pie with no extra, then you need 120 gram of butter, 120 gram of water, and 360 gram of flour. Does that make sense?
Is there a cup conversion for the ratio, this grams?
I would have to look. I don't know the conversion for the weight of flour and water and butter there. But if you were to look online, you'll be able to find out what, I do this sometimes when I'm looking at American recipes, is actually I have no concept of a cup.
Oh, they Googled
so I need to look it up.
They Googled it, so it's okay.
Yeah, you should be able to Google it.
The reason you add a little more water is because of the...
Yeah, because sometimes I leave it too long. It's okay for a little bit of extra hydration, but if you underhydrate, you end up with a very crisp, crumbly pastry. You picture if you're trying to make a normal pastry or a scone mix, if you don't add enough water, it's all crumbly, and that's what happens here. Okay. So one thing worth remembering in Singapore is that at this time of the afternoon when you're baking, it's illegal to be cooking without alcohol in your hand. So, my assistant comes to the rescue. Phew, the police aren't going to turn up. So cheers to you all. Oh, that's nice. Okay, so yes, so where are we going on this now? We should be ended up with this baking. So once we've got this boiling, and I think we're going to need the camera coming over here to the stove now. Once we've got this boiling, we're going to add it to the flour and mix. So you see, this is nearly ready. We've got little bits of unmelted butter just sitting in the middle. And really, as soon as these are melted, you see it's bubbling quite nicely. But if you had that on really, really fierce, that would be really bubbling. You'd be losing a lot of steam. You wouldn't be getting, you're not going to get the right ratio at the end. Okay. So I know that just in 1 minute, this is going to be ready. Now I've got, let's go over here. So I've got just a standard mixer with a flat paddle attachment to make my pastry with. So when all that butter was melted, I'm going to be putting that in here. I've already measured out my flour. Now, if you don't have a mixer, then obviously you can do it by hand with a wooden spoon in a mixing bowl. But be very careful, because once we take this, and it's ready now, once I take this off the stove and put it into here, this is boiling fat and water. It's a very nasty combination to get on your skin. So be very careful when we're doing that. And all I'm going to do now is turn that onto the lowest mix possible. And we'll leave that for about 4 or 5 minutes. So if you're doing this by hand, it'll take a little bit longer. And it starts off looking quite dry, starts off looking quite crumbly. And then after a few minutes, that'll all come together and go lovely and glossy. Okay, while that's mixing, I'll just go through a couple of other things that would be really useful to have to hand. Okay, so I always use spray water. This is to spray on the pastry if it gets a little bit crumbly, but it's also to spray over when you want to stick things onto the pastry. You can use a brush. I use a brush for different things.
They're asking, can you repeat what do we add to the mixer, please?
Yeah. So the mixer, we started off with the butter and the water on the stove. Once that had boiled and all the butter had melted, so it was just a yellow mixture of bubbling water and butter, that's what we added to the flour. So literally there's 3 ingredients in there. There's flour, butter and water. You must get the flour, you must get the butter and the water up to boiling, okay? And then we're mixing that up. So very soon, and it's ready now actually, so I'm going to bring this out. You can stay there, Sam. So very soon I've ended up with a very nice pliable dough. Okay, so you can see if I lift that up, it's quite strong. I can compress it. It's quite strong. It's shiny. Okay, and that means that the butter has melted. It's nicely incorporated into the flour. There's no white bits of dry flour anywhere. It's mixed very well. And I can just push this together. It's still quite warm, actually. I can just push this together, knead it a little bit, and you'll see that my hands are getting shiny. That's the fat, that's the butter in the mix, okay? So that's the consistency that you're aiming for. As I said, if you're mixing it by hand, then that'll take a little bit longer. Okay. So is everyone to that stage that's baking along? Or does I tell you what, the easy question, does anybody need any more time?
Not at that stage, not quite yet.
Okay, so while people are still getting to that stage, I'll just run through the things that will be nice to have to hand. Obviously, sanitizer is always good to have. So you'll need later an egg for glazing, or you can use milk. Doesn't have to be an egg, but an egg's quite nice to glaze with. If there are vegans out there, I just wonder what to glaze with actually. I haven't thought about that because I don't glaze my vegan pies. So I mean, you can glaze with a beaten up mixture of oil and water, but you have to do that fairly quickly because it separates very quickly. And then just some nice cutters. So I've got 2 different shapes here of hole cutters, so we can make some pretty patterns in the top of the pie. Okay, I've got a flower one and I've got an S-shaped one. So any one you like. Okay. How are we doing, folks? Anybody need any more time?
We need a little more time.
Okay.
Just to be clear, the ratio.
Yeah.
250 grams butter.
Yeah, so the ratio that we started off with, 250 grams of butter chopped into pieces, 300 grams of water into a pan, get that boiling, and then 750 grams of flour. And then mix it up. And we end up with this. Okay, well, while we're waiting then, I'll just talk a little bit about Simply Good Pies and what might be coming up, hopefully, at the end of this month. We have done a collaboration with Little Creatures Brewery at the bottom of Club Street. And we do every month, although we've had to cancel the last 2, of course, every month we do a pie tasting lunch on the last Saturday of every month. This is designed for groups of maximum at the moment will be 4, because we had to have people sitting in pairs. $36 will get you 2 people, a pint of beer each, or a glass of wine from the brewery, and 2 pies to taste, and a dessert to taste. These are all pies and desserts that are in development. They're not our finished products. And what I'm looking for is A, for people to have a good time, but B, for people to give me feedback as to what needs developing further before they come a commercial standard pie. So we've had a lot of fun with this since January. We started off with about 30 people coming a month, and now we're up to about 100 people. So if you want tickets for that, you can WhatsApp me later, and I'm sure that Rachel and Monica will be sharing my details.
Now the egg is only for the end, right?
Yes.
Glazing.
Yeah.
It's optional.
It's optional. It's optional. You don't have to glaze the pie. It just makes it look nicer. It doesn't really affect the taste. I use egg. You can use milk. You can use cream. Okay. So I'm going to move on to the next stage, unless anybody raises their hand and says stop. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to weigh out enough. So I said we've got quite a lot of mix here. We should have 1.25 kilos, I think. I've got my calculations right. Yeah, just over 1.2. So what we're going to do, I know that I need 600 grams of this, so roughly half of it, to go in our pie. I'm going to start off with the base. The base is always near enough 2/3 of the pastry. So I'm going to use 400 grams of pastry for the base. I'll just weigh that. That's not a bad guess. Okay, and 200 for the lid. That's not a bad guess either. It's almost like I've done this before. Okay, I'm going to hand this to my trusty assistant. So the pastry that's left, you can wrap in cling film. Well, I've got a Tupperware box there. We can wrap in cling film, and you can either put that in the fridge or you can freeze it. If you put it in the fridge, then you will need to, if you're going to use it again, because this is designed to be used when it's slightly warm, you'll need to bring it out about an hour or so before you're going to use it again. And the freezer, obviously, defrosted overnight in the fridge, and then bring it out for an hour or so before you use it. It might go a little bit dry. Freezers and fridges tend to dry things out. If so, just put it in a bowl and add a few drops of olive oil, and then mix it up well, and that should solve any problem. Okay. So we now have this lovely pliable. It's like a sort of warm Play-Doh. Okay. So I'm now going to put this. Let me get rid of my scales. That's my lid. Okay, so now I'm going to put the base onto the pie.
Can you repeat the quantity, the weight for today's pie?
The weight for today's pie, sure. So we're going to use 600 grams of the pastry in total. We're going to use 400 grams for the base and 200 grams for the lid. Okay.
Meaning there's enough for another pie left.
There's enough for exactly the same again pie. So you can do another pie tomorrow or next week. Father's Day, make another pie. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to slightly squash that with my hand and just make it into a rough square. Okay, it's quite nice. And then just rolling it out gently. I'm not pushing hard. In fact, I'm not pushing at all. Okay, start off one way, pick it up. See, it's a very strong pastry. Pick it up and go 90 degrees and turn it over. And just pushing it out again, okay? What we're looking for, when I take my foil, obviously I've not rolled it out enough yet, but I'm looking to see, okay, am I going to get it up all the way round, up the sides? So, it's not quite enough yet because you want a little bit of an overhang. So I'm going to do a little bit more rolling. Don't worry if you get a split in it, because it's such pliable pastry, you can just push it back together. Okay, I'm just going to lift that once more. Turn it over. Mend that split. I'm just going to go this way. I know now from experience that that is big enough. Okay, we can see that. In fact, I'm going to go just a little bit more one way. So I'm not going to turn it now because it's too thin. So I'm just going to lift it a little bit just to bring it up from the surface. One of the things about this pastry, I should have said before actually, is that you don't need flour on the surface to roll your pastry, unlike any of the cold style pastries. It's okay if you do use a little bit of flour, but you use too much and you'll dry the pastry out and it won't be as pliable.
Monica says we are still mixing the dough.
Still mixing the dough. Okay. I'll slow down a bit then. Do you know I can leave it at this stage and slow. So does that mean Monica's mixing by hand?
Let's see what she says. Nope, machine.
Okay. What is the consistency of your mix then, or is it just that it took a little bit of a while to get the butter and water mix melted?
Says it's ready, just about ready.
It's ready. Okay.
Can you show us the size of the tray compared to the dough?
Sure. Okay, so what I want on each side, this side's better, is that if I was to, you picture this coming on the inside, is that I know that I've got enough coming up each side to actually reach up the side. So if you picture that this pastry has to go into the foil and for it to come up the side. When I've rolled it out, I can put this in the middle and just picture this. Is that going to be tall enough on each side to come up the sides? Okay.
Monica's should be ready.
Now, when it's just down the mixer, this can be, when we get to this stage and it's a bit thin, this can actually be quite difficult to move around. It tends to split quite easily. So if that's the case, if yours is still really warm, we'll sit there for a minute and let it cool down a bit, and it'll actually strengthen up the flour. But I'm going to show you a little trick of how to get this into here without it splitting. Are we good to go?
Yep.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is I want to get all of this into here, and I want to do it without cracking it. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to fold it, but without any pressure at all. So I'm going to lift up one side and make sure I've got all of it, and just bring it over, fold it in half, and then it's much easier this one. Fold it in half again, okay? Then I can pick it up, and it's actually quite nice to pick up in my hand, and it's not going to split. I can put that middle corner into the middle of the foil, and then just do it reverse. So just unfold it, and just drape it over a little bit. So I turn that round, and I unfold the last bit towards me. I just find that easier, okay? And just let it fall. Don't try and push it at the moment. Just let it fall into the foil. And then the first side you went to, lift it up, and again, just let it fall into the corner, okay? Don't try and push it at this stage. And do the same, just go round the sides, just lift it backwards and let gravity push it into the corner, okay? Don't worry if it splits, I've got a split here, don't worry about that. We'll be able to repair that. Okay. And then see where if there's any air gaps or any bubbles. See, this has fallen over, that's not a problem. Very hot hands at the moment. Okay, so now I've got this pretty well into the foil. Now I am going to put a little bit of pressure and just make sure everything's pushed into the corner. Okay, so I'm going to start at one corner here. I'm going to have a flat finger and my other fingers just on the outside with a little bit of pressure. And I'm not pushing this very hard. I'm just pushing that down into the corner. It's a very gentle push. Don't squeeze and squeeze, otherwise you'll thin out the pastry and you might end up with a hole. And I'm going to do that all the way around. Because what we want, and if I see I've got a bubble here, I can see I've got an air bubble in this corner. You see it's lifted. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just lift that all back a little bit and then push that gently into the corner. We don't want any air bubbles. Now, it's not going to cause your pie a massive problem if you have any air bubbles. All it is that if you have the pastry in contact with the foil all the way round and all the way round, the foil actually browns the pastry. And when we come to bake the pie and let it rest, and then if you can lift it out of the foil and put it on a nice serving dish, it's nice that it's browned all the way around. But don't worry if you can't, don't worry if it doesn't. It still would be cooked, but it won't have that nice sort of brown gloss. Okay, so now I've got that. Is everybody at the same stage now? I think I probably need to wait a while.
Did you spray this pan?
I didn't spray the pan though. I never spray, well, that's a slight lie, but I never spray with this sort of pastry. I don't need to because there's so much butter incorporated into the mix that it actually almost sort of self-lubricates. If it was a much smaller tin, let me just find a pie tin from behind me. I do some pies in a tin like this. Of course, it's easy with foil because you can just move foil. But if I do a pie in a tin like this, then I do spray it because there's no option to try and manipulate it out in any other way. And I want to make absolutely sure it's not going to stick. But this sort of thing, no, don't need to. How's everyone getting on? Nobody's saying anything. Okay, I'll move on to the next bit. This is, I mean, it's getting more and more simple now. So now I'm going to take my mix, okay? So this is my beef mix that most of you have got. And literally, I'm just going to pour it into the pie.
Can you repair any holes with more pastry?
Can. So yes, so if I was to, and I'll make a hole, if I was to get a split down the side or something like that, okay, then yes, or if there's a hole, actually, you can just take one of these bits from the outside, or you will have more. We know we've got a lot more spare pastry. Just take a spare bit, patch it up, move it around, and while your fingers are warm, and because we've just made it, the fats are still warm in the pastry, that will all meld together quite nicely. Very simple. So don't worry if you get a hole, just plug it up with a bit more pastry, okay? Then just gently push this around. Again, you're trying not to create a hole, so good time to ask about holes. Just push this around gently. This mix must be cold when you make a pie, when you put mix into a pastry pie. So if you come to use your second half of the pastry and you follow a casserole mix or a stew mix and you make a really nice stew, really nice casserole, make sure it's absolutely chilled, that it's been in the fridge for a few hours before you put it into the pastry. Otherwise, if it's warm still, it'll melt those fats in the pastry. You'll get either a soggy bottom or a soggy side on the pie, or you'll get holes, or you'll get a complete disaster of a mess of mixed up flour and mix and etc. when you bake it. It's never going to be horrible, but it just isn't going to be a pie. Okay. So I'm now going to put the lid on. Everybody happy with where we are? So I'm going to do the same again. So I've got my 200-gram lump of pastry now. I'm just going to make a square with it, a rough square. And gently roll that out again. Turn it and turn it. And very quickly, I've got the right size for my pie tin. So if I was to lift this up gently now, you can see, if I put it down, that lid is going to fit perfectly on top with some overhang. Okay, so I'll just push that out of the way. Now here comes my useful spray tin. You see I've got a hole here right on the rim. Okay, so I'm just going to make sure that that's repaired. I don't want that's what happened when I actually just picked it up then to put it over there. I did that with my thumb. Okay, so make sure there's no holes on the rim. And then what I'm going to do is just spray it. So I'm going to spray everywhere. This is to get the pastry wet so that it'll stick to the next bit of pastry. You could, of course, just take your pastry brush and go around, and that is literally just water. But it can be water, it can be milk, it can be your egg wash, it can be any liquid you want, really. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to take my lid. I'm going to make a couple of holes in it. These are the steam vents. Now I've got an S shape. You can just put slits in. That's not cut very well. Okay. You can just put slits in. I like it with a few different shapes. Now you don't go too mad, otherwise you'll end up with too much of the liquid escaping from the pie. But I like 3 or 4 little holes. I've got my S in the middle, I've got my flowers around the outside. Okay. And then I'm going to lift that up I'm going to fold it again in half. Just lift it, go to the middle, go all the way over. Okay, so that's draped quite loosely. I'm not sticking it down yet. I'm just going to lift it so that, again, it falls by gravity, and each of the sides falls by gravity and just rests all the way around here, just like we did when we put the initial pastry into the foil tin. Okay, otherwise when you cook it, if you leave it sort of quite tight, it'll shrink the top, which doesn't look pretty. Okay, now I'm just going to crimp it before I cut the sides off. So under here we have the foil rim, so my forefinger is going to go under that rim there, and my thumb is here and just a little bit over the rim into the center, and I'm just going to pinch, not crazy hard, but I'm just pinching that together all the way around and the corner. So you need these sides to be stuck nicely to create a water and a steam proof join. Okay. Now, some people do this with a fork. You've all seen, I'm sure, those pies with a, let me just grab one actually. Okay, we've all seen pies with this sort of pattern on, so I'll just do it because people like that. And then again, all it's doing is making sure that the bottom and the top are joined together. So a thumbprint's good enough. A fork's good enough. Whichever one you want. Okay. Now I've done it, I might as well go all the way around with this. Okay. Be careful not to, I use the fork so it's facing up. You don't want to be digging in and creating holes. This is literally to help join all the way around. Okay, so I've gone all the way around. Now I'm going to use the back of a sharp knife. I don't want to use a fully sharp knife, otherwise I might cut into the foil. I'm going to angle away from the pie so that I create a little bit more lip, and I'm going to use the foil as a guide, but my knife's going to be at this sort of angle. So by the time it's cutting the pastry, it's a little bit further away from the rim than it would be if I went at this angle or straight down. Okay, so I'm going to go in a little bit, put the angle out. I'm just using that as a guide. You can use a table knife at this stage. I just tend to use the back of a sharp knife because my sharp knife's always to hand. Nearly looks good enough to eat already. So when pies were first invented, apparently it was the Greeks that invented the pie. The pastry was not edible. It was designed really as a casing, so you could actually transport the food and then eat it at the other end. And then most of development of pies was made by the English, 14th and 15th century, where these things became massive spectaculars in the middle of banquets. Again, it was about 200 years of development before actually people realized that the pastry could be quite nice and could be. So mostly it was almost used as a cooking pot for hours and hours sitting on a stove and making a casserole. They also had these wonderful pies where you had living creatures and people in them. So they'd be presented, carried by 4 or 5 people into a banquet, cut off the top, and either people or animals would run out of the pie. So 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie. When the top was open, they all began to sing. So yes, so that's where that comes from. Okay, so we should now. Is everybody up to this stage now? I can wait for a while. I'm getting jealous. Sam's eating a rather nice charcuterie board over there. Okay, so I'm going to go on to glazing. Now, I'm going to take an egg. And what I use from the egg is just the yolk. So I'm going to separate this off camera. I'll come back.
Some are still decorating.
Okay, no worries. I'll tell you what, I'll put a bit of decoration on the pie and show you how to do some easy decorating. That's not a bad idea while people are catching up. So I'm going to take a little bit of pastry and I'm going to make some leaves. So when we do decorate, we want to do it quite thin. So just take a bit of leftover pastry. I'm going to roll it out thin. Okay, and then cut some rough leaf shapes out. So I'm just going to create 3. Doesn't matter what size you do these. You could do these really huge actually, but you want them quite fat in the middle, otherwise you can't lift them up. Okay, there's 1. There's 2. There's 3. Okay, use that for something else in a minute. And then what I do when I'm making leaves, I just cut on each side, just a few millimeters in. I do about 3 or 4 cuts on each side, all the way through. These are not just scoring, it's all the way through. Okay, and you can see, if I was to lift that up, you can see that that's sort of separated. Okay, so I'm going to do 3 of those. You can do any pattern. We do big pork pies, 20 centimeter in diameter, like a birthday cake, 2 kilos, feeds a lot of people. We do those with people's names on top as birthday cakes or Father's Day gifts, topically timely at the moment. So yeah, pork pies with people's names on, and then we use, I've got a whole load of stencil, that's obviously an S. We use different stencils and move out. So to stick pastry onto pastry, I'm just going to spray this again with my spray water. I could, of course, just use water and a brush. I'm going to put these 3 leaves together on one side. Just avoiding that hole. I'm just going to give it a stem. So just a long straight piece of pastry off cuts. I've sprayed that already, so that's still wet. Okay. There's a nice stalk for my leaves. And I'm going to put 3 little berries on it as well. So just tiny little balls of pastry. There's 1. There's 2. There's 3. Okay. Press it down a little bit. Doesn't have to be too hard. Okay, there we go. Now I'll have to wait because everyone wants to create a stalk and flowers on their pie. So the best glaze of all glazes is egg yolk. So I've separated my egg here as much as I can. And then I'm going to put a little bit of water in. It would leave me about 3 or 4 drops. I'm actually going to give it 2 or 3 sprays, but 2 or 3 drops of water, and then mix that up. Okay, the water just gives it a little bit more liquid. You can use milk, as I say. You can use cream even with a little bit of water in. But the using an egg yolk with a tiny bit of water gives the best streak-free glaze on pastry. So I'm going to start at the outsides. I don't want to get any sort of underneath the pastry and going between the pastry and the foil. Otherwise, that'll create a sticking, burning point. It won't be a massive problem, but it'll make your pastry stick to your foil. Okay, so I go around the outside first, so I know that I've done the outside, and then I'm being careful of the pattern that I've created. I'm just going to go over it.
Mark, Yvonne asks if the extra pastry can be used for another pie.
Yeah, absolutely. Can be used for anything. You can make pasties out of it. You could make a quiche base with that as well. So you could just use it as a, you could blind bake it into a round foil, and then make a quiche out of it. If you just treat it like short crust pastry, it's not quite as sort of flaky as short crust pastry, but it's very similar in how it works. So treat it as short crust pastry. But once you have stored it a little while, like I say, you need to let it come back up to a slightly warmer than a chilled temperature in order for it to be soft enough to roll out. If you start rolling it and you find, this is obviously the leftover pastry, and you find it's gone brittle, either leave it out a little bit longer in non-aircon. If it's still a bit brittle, then it needs to have a little bit more fat added to it. So a few drops of olive oil and then knead it.
So we don't use the entire egg yolk.
No, we get left with a lot of egg yolk now. Have to make something else with it. Okay, then I'm going to put that in the oven. I'm going to put this on a baking tray. And center of the oven, set a timer. So different pies, obviously of different sizes, take different time to cook. I make all of my single sized pies in a pie tin this big, which is 12 centimeter or 11 centimeter size. These take 21 minutes to cook at 180. I know that this big one will take 30 to 35 minutes to cook the pastry. Funnily enough, different pie mixtures, so the centers, actually make the pie cook at a different time. Essentially, of course, we've cooked everything already. All we're doing is cooking the pastry. So why is it that some pies take 20 minutes and some pies take 40 minutes when you're using the same pastry? It's actually what you put in the middle of the pie and then the texture you want at the end. Okay, so I'm going to set a timer for 30 minutes. And these things aren't exact, so we will look at it after 30 minutes. We will look at it after 30 minutes and judge whether it's cooked or not. So I hope in 30 minutes' time, I'm going to get lots of pictures of you, all of you cooking. I'm going to get lots of pictures of you lovely baking pies in the oven. Okay.
180 Celsius for 30 minutes.
180 Celsius for 30 minutes.
How much water in the egg yolk?
It's a few drops. So it's literally 3 or 4 drops to one egg yolk. I did a spray of my spray water, but it is 3 or 4 drops. It's a tiny amount. It's just what's called loosening it. You're loosening the proteins. How's everyone doing?
Silence.
Silence. Okay.
I missed the start. Sorry. Could you please share pastry measurements again? Those are up. I'll just copy those.
I can talk about that now.
Okay.
Mr. Start, so need the measurements.
Yeah, Donna says, I missed the start. Could you please share pastry measurements again?
Sure. So the amount of pastry that we're making with the ingredients I told you to get is twice the amount that you'll need. So I'm going to make you use all the butter and part of the flour. And then we'll have enough to make another pie at a different time. So we were talking at the start about ratios. So that we use a ratio for this pastry of 1:1:3, which is 1 part butter, 1 part water, and 3 parts flour. So for the purposes of making our pastry today, 250 gram of butter, 250 gram of water, and 750 gram of flour. And then I always add a little bit more water, just because you lose some water because we're going to boil it. And the method of this pastry, the reason I use this pastry, the hot crust pastry, is that in this climate, it's actually quite difficult to use to make short crust, and particularly puff pastry. You need a really cold temperature controlled room, or you need everything at ice cold temperature. So what we did was we took the butter and the water, we put it into a pan, and we boiled that until all the butter has melted. And we've added that to the flour and mixed it, and come up with and it's still warm actually, come up with a pliable, lovely dough that's actually very strong. Okay. Now the same flour, I'm going to show you a couple of things. The same flour, the same type of pastry is used in the UK, although we don't use butter, we use pig fat or lard. The same type of pastry is used to make a traditional pork pie. Now, the pork pie is known as a hand-raised pie, and that's because it's literally you form the cup of the pie with your hands, and you raise it up the side of a pie dolly. So this is different sized pies, and that's the traditional way of making pork pies. So we take whatever weight we're going to do of pastry, okay, make it into a ball. Done this in one, okay. Make it into a ball. Wants to be a little bit sort of roughly the same size diameter as this. So I'm just doing this while your pie is baking. You see, this is a little bit of pie knowledge, okay. We take our dolly and we put it onto there, and we push and we push and we push, okay. And after a short time, actually it starts just lifting. These bits start lifting off the side, and then we just bring it up and we go around in a circle. And you can see what I'm doing with my hand is just bringing it up the side of the dolly. And I can actually now lift that up, turn it over. And this is how all traditional pork pies used to be made. So when you hear the word Melton Mowbray, that's where traditional pork pies come from in the UK. It's like an appellation that you have in France for your wines. Melton Mowbray pork pie has to come from, I think, a 3-mile radius of the town of Melton Mowbray. This is how they do it a lot faster than I do. This is how they make their pork pies, okay? Imagine doing this all day, every day, making pies. And then we'll just bring that off. I should have put some flour on it first. I've not done that very well. Just bring that off.
We've got a question here, Mark, about whether, could you use this pastry for an apple pie or a sweet pie as well?
You could do, but it's a little bit crispy for that. What I would do if I was going to do that is to keep the same measurements, go back to your mixing bowl, and add a small amount of sugar. So to a 600-gram lump of pastry, I would add maybe 50 grams of sugar. Okay, and then mix that in, and that'll just thin it out a little bit. And it'll give some sweetness for an apple pie. But yes, perfectly good.
Okay, so 60 grams of sugar that was.
So if I was gonna, the other half of the pastry that you have, which is roughly 600 grams, I would put about 50 grams of sugar into that in a mixing bowl. So it's not a lot, but it's just add a little bit of sweetness to it. Okay, so I'm actually going to show you how we make our pork pies here in Singapore. So I use a tin. I cheat because it makes it much quicker. So pork pies are always done with a raw pork mixture. Now I know the amount of weight that I need. 140, that's not a bad guess. Okay, for my pork pie here. So I have a spring mold that I make my pork pies with. This pastry, this is the butter pastry. It'll be okay just for this for today, but normally, as I say, we use the same ratios, but we've used pig fat instead of butter. That's the traditional way. Okay, I'm just going to push this in to my spring tin. And then I have a mixture here of chopped pork and a little bit of and half with minced pork. So I like the texture. So it is just literally pork and seasoning, and I just use salt, pepper, and dried thyme. Okay. I know for this pie, the total needs to be about 450. So there's very few pies really where you'd put raw meat into the pie to start with. Most pies that we make, like the steak and ale, you know, you'd have made the mixture over quite some time. Because if you're trying to get a stew out of a pie, you'd have to cook it for 4 hours, and the pastry would be, that's when you end up with a pastry that you're not going to eat. That's what they used to do, as I say, in the 1600s back in the UK. Okay, so I'm going to push that all down, get rid of that, and just wash my hands. Okay, let's go a little bit more pastry. So when I started off, nearly 2 years ago, making pork pies, we used to do maybe 300 maximum pork pies a month. Now we make about 1,200 pork pies every month. So the word's got out, and more people are eating pork pies. Of course, pork pies are always eaten chilled. It's a very peculiarly British thing. So again, you see, I'm just letting gravity pull this pastry down. I'm going to move that off the scales.
Stuart asked for pork pie ingredients again.
Pork pie ingredients is literally just pork. So I make the pastry same ratios, but I use pork lard instead of butter. And then within there is chopped and minced pork and seasoning, nothing else.
Stuart also asked, who is eating all these pies?
Who ate all the pies? Look for the larger English people for the pork pies. If you see large English people walking around the island, chances are they're probably eating pork pies. Actually, when I started off, I thought that my clientele would mostly be expats, and certainly to start with, when I only had the pork pie as a recipe, it was about 80 to 90% were Brits. Now it's about 50% what I would call expats, so mostly English, Australian, New Zealand, and then 50% locals. Okay, so I'm just going to take the top off this. This is much easier than doing the foil one. Okay, so I crimped it to start with, and then now I'm actually going to, because I'm not going to cook it in its tin, I'm just going to take it out of here, and there we have a classic pork pie. And then done this a few times, just crimping it around and then pushing that in. So this crimping, yeah, it looks pretty, but it also, as I say, it strengthens that seal around the top. Okay, and then I have a pork pie. Now this, even though it's half the size or even a third of the size of the pie that we made before, this would actually cook for 55 minutes in the oven. Okay, I glaze just the top, not the outside, and that cooks for 55 minutes in the oven, and then we cool it down. When it cools, because we're cooking this raw pork mixture from scratch, is that as it cooks, water escapes, fat escapes, and some of that evaporates out. So actually the middle shrinks, and we end up with a space around the outside. So we could, once it's all cooled down, you could almost rattle that. So with pork pies, what we do is we make a mixture of pork stock and natural gelatin. When this is all cooled down, we pour that in, cool it down again, and that sets into a jelly. And that's the traditional English pork pie. Shouldn't have lots of seasoning in. Literally, I use salt, pepper, and thyme. And that I'm going to put in. Let's see what we've got the oven left at the moment. 17 minutes. So we're halfway through the cooking. Let's have a look in our oven. and see how that pie is doing. A little bit of browning coming, and that's cooking nicely. I'm going to close that, keep it going. Okay, we've got about 17 minutes left. Okay, that I'm going to cook later, so I'm just going to put that back on.
So you
to shape
pour
it.
gelatin into the pie.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just putting this back on because I'm going to put it in the fridge to, no, it's the other way out. Put it in the fridge and then cook it later. It's not going to go on, is it? Yes, it is. Okay, so I can cook that later. So I guess New Zealand. So New Zealand's known for its pies. I think the New Zealand pie and the, dare I say it, the Aussie pie are relatively similar. So essentially a minced beef and onion pie with gravy. What are the favourite pies? I know some of you buy from me anyway, and some of you see my menu. But what are the favourite pies that you guys have from home? Are you getting any answers, or is everybody messing around with their
Mince and cheese
mince and cheese?
from Rachel.
That sounds good. Actually, our next pie lunch, which hopefully we'll be able to say host at the end of this month, one of the pies in development is a Philly cheesesteak. So it's more or less steak and Guinness stew, and then I'm going to put provolone and maybe mozzarella. I want that string effect, but maybe provolone and big slices of onion, and cook that after we cook the pie.
We have a lot now. Lamb and mint, steak, venison and cranberry,
Oh, venison and cranberry.
butter chicken, and farley.
Farley,
Farlie.
Farlie. I don't know what that is actually.
Rebecca says steak, red wine. Oh, that's a place.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, some of those sound good. I don't have a lamb pie on at the moment, although I've got a special for next weekend. We're doing a plug again. A special for next weekend. So the family-sized pie that you're doing, I'm doing 2 of those, literally just for next weekend. One of them is an oxtail, mushroom, and Guinness, and the other is a lamb shank in red wine with parsnips.
Farley Bakery also sell the best salmon pies.
Ah, that sounds good. Actually, when I launched an Aussie pie a month ago, and I wondered how well it would sell. With any pie company or any sort of pub that does pies, your steak and ale or variant, so steak and ale, beef and Guinness, whatever it is, beef insider, that's normally the one that sells 40 or 50% of all the pies sold, and the rest is made up of every other flavour that you do. Actually, when I launched the Aussie pie, suddenly that's nearly overtaken the steak and ale pie or the beef and Guinness pie.
Steak and kidney.
Steak and kidney. I love steak and kidney. We're having arguments at the moment. I mean, I've got a steak and kidney on the menu, and 2 of my customers, when they've ordered it, they love it, but they're not happy with the ratio. So we talk about ratios all the time in baking, as I said. So how much kidney do you want in your steak and kidney pie? Personally, I love kidney, so I'd go almost 1-1 steak to kidney. In my commercial pies, I did it 4 parts steak to 1 part kidney. Somebody who hasn't had a lot of kidney before said that's too much even. And my pie aficionado said that's nowhere near enough kidney.
Rachel says you need to launch a kiwi pie.
A kiwi pie. So what is the archetypal kiwi pie? I shall shut up about Aussie pies because you'll shoot me from the New Zealand Chamber of Commerce. What is the classic archetypal kiwi pie then? Is it minced beef and onion and gravy?
Shall we?
Yeah, I think it would be a mince pie. Or a bit of lamb one would be pretty kiwi, right?
It would be lamb mince with it.
Oh, that'd be nice.
That'd be nice.
Generally beef mince in New Zealand, but yeah, there's also a question here from Anne. What's the filling recipe for the beef filling? She was late joining, so missed it.
For the beef, yeah. So I didn't really discuss how I made the fillings that were delivered to you guys. So the way I do my steak and ale is that I start off with a weighed out amount of onion, celery, and carrots. Sorry, I'm just going to wash my hands. I've got some gravy on it from somewhere. I think it came from that cloth that I will mop up the gravy with, so we'll get rid of that. Yes, so the steak and ale, or steak and Guinness, as you have, takes about 5 or 6 hours of cooking. So I started off with onion, celery, and carrot in the equal proportions. And the way I measure it is that however much steak, or in the same with the chicken one, however much meat that I have half the quantity of the combined vegetables. So I started off, I make my mixes in 20 or 30 kilo batches. So if I have 10 kilos of beef, I then have 5 kilos of the mix of vegetables. So that'll be 1 1/3 of onion, 1 1/3 of carrot, 1 1/3 of celery. No, that only makes 4, doesn't it? 1.6. So 1 2/3 of a kilo. Okay. So the onion, celery, and carrots, I will cook in a bit of oil, usually olive oil, and I'll cook that on the lowest heat possible for about 45 minutes. Okay. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get those natural sugars to develop. I'm trying to get some liquids that comes out of those 3 vegetables as well, and to soften it. So after 45 minutes, and I've had it covered, so it's steamed. Some of it's got a little bit of browning. After 45 minutes, then I will take that out and I'll caramelize the beef. I generally don't caramelize chicken because I like quite a white chicken sitting in my pies. Okay, so I've cooked for 45 minutes on a very low heat the onion, celery, and carrot. You can add garlic at some stage if you like garlic, but I leave it out. I've taken it all out of the pan. I then use the same pan. Make sure I've got all the bits of onion, celery, and carrot out, but I'm leaving the oil residue. Pour a little bit more oil in. I get my beef, which is cubed. I dust it in a little bit of flour, which helps the thickening towards the end. So a little bit of seasoned flour, and then I put that into the pot in stages. So depending on how big my pot is, and depending on how much beef I'm putting in, I want to put in a layer of beef that's just a single layer of beef, so I can caramelize and get that slightly charred edge on the beef. Okay, so I might have to do 3 or 4 batches of browning off the meat. Okay, and I've got a big bowl that I've got my onion, celery, carrot in. Brown some beef off. It goes in there. Brown some beef off. Put it into there. When it's all done, then I'm going to take a liquid, which is either going to be red wine or beer. My pan is pretty hot. My pan's got sticky bits of flour and meat and etc. in the bottom of it. So I'm going to deglaze the pan. So keeping the heat and getting a flat spatula, I pour some of the beer in and I'll scrape all that stuff up. And that's the goodness. Don't throw that away for goodness sake. So I'm going to scrape all that up and I should end up with a nice liquid and nothing stuck now to the base of the pan. Then I'm going to put everything back in. Okay. So all of the onion, celery, carrot, all the beef, all the everything. I'm going to put that back in the pan, and then I'm going to add more of the cooking liquid. So I use pretty much 80% Guinness as my cooking liquid, and 20% is stock. The stock I use is obviously the stock that we make, but you can use stock cubes, absolutely fine. And I use a very reduced stock, so I use a demi-glace. Which is a stock that's been reduced till it's almost jelly. But if you're cooking at home and you haven't got a stock and you don't want to make a stock, you don't want to go and buy an expensive stock, then actually I've experimented with this when I was doing a previous cookery class. And actually, when you've got your beef in your pan, Pour enough Guinness in so it's just leaving some of the beef out of the cooking liquid. Get that up to heat. Leave it for about 5 minutes boiling, not too rapidly, otherwise you're going to start burning the beef at the bottom of the pan. But get that boiling, let the alcohol boil off, and then just literally add 1 or 2 stock cubes to that liquid. And then turn it right down when the stock cubes are dissolved. So no water. When stock cubes are dissolved, put a lid on it. Put it on the lowest heat you can possibly get from your cooker. You know, my gas one, you can turn it down to a tiny flame. If it's an electric one, you might need a diffuser of some sort. Turn it down to the very, very lowest that you can. Put the lid on and just leave it. Leave it for about 5 hours. Come and check it after the first 30 minutes. Because you want it, when you look into the pan, you want it to be just ever so slightly bubbling. It can't, if it's boiling, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be forcing all the moisture out of the meat chunks, and you'll end up with very dry chunks of meat. So the lowest heat you can get, which is just trickling a few bubbles on the surface of the water when you lift the lid off. As soon as you lift the lid off, those bubbles will stop after a few seconds. So lift the lid, have a look, tiny little bubbles, perfect. Lots and lots of strong bubbles, no, you're too hot, turn it down. Put the lid on, ignore it, go to bed, 5 hours, and then come back, and it will be done. Okay, now I'm looking at my timer. We've got 5 minutes left, it says. Okay, that looks really good. I've got wonderful smells coming through the kitchen. How many people have got wonderful cooking smells of pies coming into their kitchen and where they are now? I hope that everyone has this wonderful pie smell coming.
Us, Monica, Kate. Yes.
That's fantastic. I'll tell you what then, how many people are not cooking their pie today? How many people are waiting?
Well, Anne asks, I will never remember this all after event. Can you please send full recipe?
Certainly. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be emailing Rachel and or Monica with all of the stuff we've discussed today. So the ratios for pastry, the different pastries. I'll talk a little bit as well in that email about the different pastries you can use, and roughly the way that how I'd like to build up a pie mix. So the pie mix for the chicken obviously doesn't take 5 or 6 hours. That takes about 45 minutes to an hour in total, because if you keep on cooking the chicken, it'll end up just disintegrating and end up with something else. So the chicken, again, I start off with the same. I start off with those the mirepoix, the 3, as the French would call it, 3 vegetables. Cook that for half an hour to 45 minutes. Then add the chicken. I use leg meat for the pie. I don't use breast meat. Breast meat I find goes very, very dry because there's no fat in it at all. So cubed or big slices or whatever of the leg meat. Move that around until it's got hot. A little bit of liquid you want to put in there. So I use cider and chicken stock. So you probably want in that size pie, there's probably about half a pint in total of cooking liquid. And once I've cooked that, I don't dust the chicken in flour before I put it in. Once I've actually cooked it and I've tasted it and seasoned it, then I actually use corn flour to thicken it a little bit. If you have your pie mixture too wet, so if it looks like a clear soup with the water, the liquid being the consistency of water or milk, when you put it into the pie and cook it, that'll steam up a lot. It'll come out the top of the hole in the pie. You'll end up with something that's a little bit too liquid, and as soon as you cut into the pie, it all just comes out and it doesn't hold the meat very well. So things that you wouldn't cook before you put in a pie are, I mean, venison actually. I would make a venison pie, 2 different variants. I would do a venison pie a little bit like a pork pie. So I'd do it as an English game pie, which again, you either eat straight out of the oven or you eat it cold. You have that, you put I do I haven't done it here, it's far too expensive to get game here, but I do a game pie where I'll layer it up with mincemeat in between, 2 or 3 different things, and that's all raw, and it's cooked like a pork pie. Chill it down, put the jelly in, and let that set. I do a confit duck pie here, where I'll confit the duck overnight, and then do half and half with chicken mince and confit duck, pistachios and apricot. Then that's cooled down again and eaten like a pork pie.
What wine is good with the steak pie?
To drink with it or to make steak pie with?
Probably to make. You add it in the steak.
What are we saying? So
Both.
So both. Okay. If you're going to cook with red wine, don't go for something massively heavy, and don't go for something that's really got a lot of oak in. I would stick to something quite light. There is an argument, and I do this sometimes, of actually using white wine for cooking. But get an unoaked red wine. It can be as plummy or as light as you like. But if you use a wine with a really heavy oak in it, what you end up with when you cooked it is that really dry, I forget what the word is, but the really dry tannin taste of the wine takes over everything, and it's really quite unpleasant. So the best thing to do is to pick a fruity style red wine, or a floral style white wine to cook with, and actually to drink with. Anything like.
Is it traditional to have ketchup with chicken pie? What matching food with pie? Salad, etc.
Depends how healthy you want to be. Traditionally, pie would be in the UK. A hot pie would go with mashed potato and gravy and peas. A pork pie, for instance, would go with some sort of sharp chutney or pickle, because they're quite dense, and the meat is very dense and it's cold, so you want something to cut through that sort of fatty thing. But yeah, salads are, my alarm is going. Let's have a look in here. But salads are good. Now, I'm just going to show you this, because this is going to need to go back in. So we can see the pastry on the top is pretty well done, but there's some little bits that are not quite cooked, okay? I'm just going to drop the foil. It's a little bit hot, that. If I can do that. Have a look down the side. Yeah, there we go. So if I just have a look down the side here, I can see that that's a little bit, yeah, I think that needs another 5 minutes. We've got a few bits of uncooked pastry on the top. If that was a lot darker, I would leave it. So I'm going 5 minutes on that. It's perfectly edible now. Could just take that out if you're really hungry and eat it. Okay, so things to go with pies. Certainly with the richer meat pies, I would go with something to soak it up. So a mashed potato, mashed carrot, mashed swede, mashed parsnip, anything of that sort of mashed variety. With the chicken pie, I mean, actually, if you think about soaking things up, a really good crisp lettuce with a pie also goes well with that gravy that comes out of the pie. Depends if you want to eat it hot or cold. Cold pie is generally like an English pork pie would go with what we call a band, so go with cheese, pickle, bread, pate, ham, that sort of extended salad. But mostly I would go with mashed potato and gravy, make it even richer. How's everyone's pie looking? I want to see some pictures coming up soon. So of course, every culture, another sip of beer, every culture in the world has pie. So over here, of course, we have the curry puff, which is a pie. Indians have samosas. So anything wrapped in pastry that you can take with you. In the UK, there's various pies that were made for people that went down mines or down into quarries to work. So the most famous is the Cornish pasty. So the Cornish pasty is the same shape but much larger, same shape as a curry puff, and the knurled side seam all the way down one side normally had a much thicker bit at one end. And that's actually designed, the pastry was not particularly pleasant. It was very robust, very solid. It was designed to go in a miner's pocket. So we'd have that as a lunch. And the bit to hold on to with his very, very dirty fingers was never eaten. So it was literally just the pastry is there, like a very old style pies. Pastry's there just to hold the filling for you to eat later. And where I come from, in Bedfordshire, just north of London, we have a thing called the Bedfordshire Clanger, which not a lot of places serve these days, but that's actually a complete meal in a pastry. So it's a long rectangular pasty, and at one end it has a savoury meat filling, and at the other end it has a sweet fruit filling. So you can start off with a steak and ale, and end up with a rhubarb and custard, or apple crumble then, but yeah, sort of apple sweet. Okay, I think I'm going to bring that out. Stick it on a board. Okay, so when we bring a pie out, we're not going to eat it instantly. We need to let it relax. So like you would when you bring a steak out or a piece of roast meat, we're just going to let that relax. Let the pastry settle. And then we could actually take it out of the foil. So I'm going to let that relax for about 5 minutes plus. I'm going to put it on a different board actually. Just seen I put it on my very expensive new board. Okay. Hopefully everyone will have something like that in the next 5 or 10 minutes. So just to recap, I'll give it a quick recap, and hand back over to Rachel. So all of the ratios, all of the measurements that we've spoken about, we will send on an email. When you think about how much pastry you want to go in a different pie, Sam, can you pass on one of those rectangular foils?
Yep.
So we just need to work out really what our weight is of the final pie, and then we can work out what weight of ingredients we want. So as I say, we started off here knowing that I'm going to end up with a 1 kilo to 1 to 1.2 kilo pie. Thank you. So I know how much filling I need, and I know how much filling I need, and I know how much pastry I need. So I know that I wanted 600 grams of pastry to make this pie. We made twice as much. But if I know how much pastry I want, because I know that it's a ratio thing, I can work out how much butter and how much flour and how much water. So if I wanted to start off with literally just 600 grams of pastry, then divide that by 5, and I get 120 grams of butter, 120 grams of water, 360 grams of flour. And that makes that my 600 grams of pastry. Once we cook it, the pastry weighs less because the water comes out of it, and that's why the pastry turns crispy. So if I'm going to want, I know that this fits a 500 to 600 gram pie. So it's easy when I want a 500 gram pie. That's 250 grams worth of pastry. That's 50 grams butter, 50 grams water, and 50 grams of flour. So that's why it's nice really to think in ratios, because you can work out whatever size of recipe you want, and then work it out what the weight's going to be, rather than following the recipe that says your pastry is 100 grams, and then you've got to multiply that down. Okay. So this is ready to eat now, or at this stage we could chill that right down. We could freeze it, and then keep it for a different day. At any stage of the process, we can freeze for a different time. So once we've actually made our pie, before we put it into the oven. We could freeze it at that stage and then cook it at a different time. It's much nicer for a pie that it's actually cooked just once and then served to and then serve it, rather than heating it up, cooling it down, and then reheating it. But when you reheat it the second time, the pastry loses a bit more of its moisture. It becomes a little bit more brittle. It'll still be very tasty. So when we do our pies, for instance, so our pies will always be baked twice. We bake them once, and then we freeze them, and then you bake them again. Is that we only cook it to about 80% done, and hoping that in that final cook that you have is really just reheating and that last bit of cooking of the pastry. So it's not a deteriorate anything to deteriorate in the pastry. Any questions from anybody? Well, I'm going to pass over back to Rachel.
Instagram handle
#, Simply Good Pies. Any pictures, stick them all up there, please.
And also, if you we've got at NZ Chamber SG, if you tag us on your photos as well, and then we can share them too, that would be fab.
Brilliant.
Yeah. So look, thanks so much for sharing all your pie wisdom with us today, Mark. I honestly wasn't expecting the pastry to be that easy, and I'm delighted that I know how to do a pastry that works in Singapore now. So
I call this my bulletproof pastry. It is, it's a bit of a hybrid, but it's designed to be extremely simple, and it works so well in this weather. I tried with a number of different pastries and manipulated different recipes, and then it was actually a guy that runs an award-winning pie company in the UK who came and sat with us in the Rabbit Carrot Gun that I'm sure some of you know on the East Coast, the British pub. And we were sitting talking about pies, and I was asking him. He said, "Well, of course, I just do a butter hot cross pastry." And I looked at him. I'm like, "Oh, right, okay." And this was when I was developing different pastries and I was in developmental stage for the whole business then. I listened to him, and then it was only about a week or two later that I came up with the definitive Simply Good Pies recipe that we use for most of our hot style pies.
Look, I love it, and I'm excited. I've got some pastry in the freezer now to pull out today and make a different kind of pie, I guess. So look, thank you so much for today, and everyone, we will email you all Mark's notes and tips and it's a fact sheet, isn't it, that you're going to send us?
Yeah, I'm going to send you a sort of item, a spreadsheet, a fact sheet, and then you can just you can email me with questions. So if there's anything you want to know, very, very simple. Email address is Mark with a K, mark@simplygoodpies.com. So if you want to know for tomorrow to make something else, then just email me and I'll come straight back to you.
Love it, thanks. I'm also looking forward to coming to one of your pie tastings.
Yeah. I'll put details of that as well, but it's all on the website. It's all on the website as well. So simplygoodpies.com. Have a look on there. There's lots of stuff, and I'm trying to develop a bit of a blog and a bit of a talky thing on there. So I've not quite got to there yet, but over the next couple of weeks there'll be a sort of recipe and facts and a little bit more sort of soft information on the site.
Great. Well, thanks so much. We're off to give our pie a taste.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, I've got 2 people coming in a bit to come and eat this. So brilliant.
Great. Hey, thanks for your time today, and looking forward to hearing from you soon.
Super. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.